Hello everyone, I'm called a cadet. I have my hands full today because today I'm going to be comparing this Osborne Mitre Gauge with a more traditional looking Incra Mitre Gauge. Now this isn't a review to see which one is better. This is just a comparison to show you how the two of them work and what things I liked and what things I don't like on both of them. Both of my units came with something called T-clips, and if you look closely at the bottom of my table saw miter gauge slot here, or miter slot, you'll notice that there's a little clip on each side. Not all table saws have this, but what that's for is so that your miter gauge can hold in that little area like that. I find these extremely annoying, and the very first thing I do is take these off because the kind of cuts that I make using my miter gauge, I don't want to have to be fighting to take my miter gauge off, because you can't take it off. You either have to pull it out this way or go to the other end. Now while I'm talking about that, let me show you something here. Now I've just taken a moment to add the clip to this miter gauge to show you this. Basically the way they work is the clip holds in that T so that you can't lift that miter gauge out in the middle of your slot because that T is preventing it. So you need to go to the end, but a lot of people try and put miter gauge with these clips in this way, and depending on the saw, this one's not bad, but a lot of times you struggle because you've got this big weight and you're trying to line things up. No. The best way, if you're using the clip, the best way is to put it at the end of your saw and draw it back like that. That way you don't have to worry about bending this clip or getting it twisted, because if you do that, it'll bind in this T slot in here. Now the first thing you need to do with any miter gauge before you even begin to set it up is to make sure that it's as snug as you can get it in the miter slot. You don't want to have any movement back and forth, and these are typically made to be a little bit on the slim side, and they usually give you something to sort of make this fit in. This one here, the Incra, comes with these nylon, these split, you can see them there, and I think you can maybe see that one on there. Let me tip that up there, and maybe you can see that that's split. And the way this works, and it seems to work fine, you bear down on that screw, and as you tighten that screw, this washer splits apart, and as it splits apart, it expands. So there's three, I think three of these, there's one, or at least one or two under here as well, and it expands so that it fits in there, the bar fits in there snugly. Now that's not bad. I wasn't crazy about that idea, but it seems to work, and you know what, they give you all sorts of spares, and if you needed more, I'm sure you could order more, but that's what Incra does, and that's one of the things that I wasn't that crazy about. Here's what the Osborne does, and I actually really like this part of this miter gauge. They actually have, if you look closely, there's a split, and there's three of them. There you can see those splits there. And they have little wedge screws in there, little Allen screws in there. And as you tighten those screws in there, what it does is it pushes the metal apart. So to make this snug, you actually are moving that metal apart a little bit, and you can be very precise with it by moving it back and forth. And I really like that. I thought that was a really good idea to keep this bar nice and snug in there, and it was pretty easy to set up as well. Let's start off with a little bit more detailed look at the Osborne. And first of all, you'll notice that this is a little different design than many that you've seen. This triangulation is supposed to give you a little bit better support, and it makes sense just because of the design of it. Now, the one thing that I did like about this fence moves easily back and forth with a couple of wing nuts here. It also has an extension that you can pull out, and it's quite a long extension, and it also has a flip stop on it, and of course the flip stop will run to the extension or to the main part of the fence. So that worked really well with those little wing nuts. Now I'm going to flip this over for a second so I can show you all of the holes on the back of this little bar. Oh, and there's a little button there too that you can push down. The way this miter gauge works, all of the degrees are laid out along this bar, and you can see that it's set at 0 right now, and those little holes are set at 5, 10, 15, and so on. And the way it works, you loosen the little wing nut here, and then you just move it back and forth to whatever degree you want. Then when you push the little button, it locks in, for example, to 15 degrees. You tighten up the bar, and that is all set, ready to go. The one thing that I wasn't crazy about on this unit was setting intermediary degrees. Now there's 10 degrees, but I use 12.5 quite often. So to set that, I kind of have to guess that that's about 12.5 degrees. So to make an accurate setting on that, I'd probably want to use another measuring device to double check where that setting is. So the angle moves in both directions, so you can set it wherever you want, lock it into 0, and the instructions say that this was set up at the factory to be at 90 degrees, and when I checked it and ran some wood through my saw, it was actually set up perfect, so that was nice to see. Next we have the Incra, and there's a number of models. This one is the 1000SE, so there are some differences in the models. This one also has the flip stop, and it also has a fence extension, but with the Incra, you need to use this special tool because these are hexagon bolts in there, and that's what you need to use. So you need to keep this little screwdriver handy if you're using those fence extensions, and the whole fence will move as well, just like the Osborne, but again, you need this special little screwdriver to tighten and loosen those little bolts on there. The flip stop on this one is a little bit different. It has a little bit of a ribbed plastic extrusion in there, and it'll fit, of course, on the main part or on the extension, and it actually grabs it quite nicely because it uses these nylon screws, and you don't need to tighten these very tight for that to stay rigid. So that was kind of a nice design. I like that idea of that. There's a close-up look at all of the degree settings on both sides, and in this case it has a little sharp little point that fits in there, and it sort of locks in there, and you can lock it with this one as well as the black knob here, and it's nice and tight when you do that. What I did like about this one, for setting, for example, 12.5 degrees, it also has this secondary little scale. I'm going to set that up like that, and when I move that top scale, now I can move that, align that 0 with the 10.5 degree or 12.5 degrees there. That should be very, very accurate. That should be set up exactly where I want that. So that was a nice feature on this unit. One of the things that was a surprise, and a nice surprise on this unit, was you can actually take this and turn this, and there's a stop at 90 degrees, and in fact you can on both sides you can actually go beyond 90 degrees, and I don't know, it doesn't even have a measure there of what that is, so you'd have to check that and see. But even at 90 degrees you now have a miter gauge that is running parallel to the saw blade. So there might be some interesting jigs that you could make with that. I haven't done anything with it yet, but it's just a nice feature that I really liked on this unit. While we're at the table saw, I want to talk briefly about checking your miter gauge for square. You'll notice off in the corner here I have some white MDF melamine. This is what I use for checking my squares. I'm not using it today because it throws the light meter off on my camera, so I'm using this natural wood instead. What I often see people doing when they're checking their miter gauges, they're using a little piece of wood 2 or 3 inches long, running that through their saw blade, and then using one of these tri-squares to check to make sure that it's square. And to be honest with you, unless you've got an engineer's tri-square, these inexpensive ones are often not accurate. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but I never ever trust these. And this is not enough wood to be checking. So let's put that off. Now, when you look at your table saw, you'll notice that you have a lot of area here between the blade and where the miter gauge can sit. And what you want to do is get as much wood as you can for testing. So in this case, I've got a piece of plywood. It's flat along this side. And what you would do is run that through your table saw blade right through to the end. Now, you want to use a rigid steel square that you've checked to make sure it's square, and use that to test if your miter gauge is accurate, and that will give you far more accurate results than using a small piece of wood and a tri-square. Now, there are other methods of checking the squareness of your miter gauge, and I'm going to cover those off in another video. But for what we're doing, for 95% of the woodworking that we're doing, this method is quick, easy, and accurate. Well, that concludes my video today, and I think some of you are going to be disappointed because I know some of you are going to want to know which was my favorite. And honestly, I liked both of them. They both worked very well. I had no issues with either one of them. And if you selected one or the other, now you know the features of each one. What's really important is not what I like. What's really important is what you like and what works for your woodworking. I'm Colin Canet for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching.